Cool. So thank you very much for joining us virtually with a time delay in our sex therapy interest group. And I think this is a much nicer alternative than you getting up in the middle of the night.
Me too, yeah.
But I do really
appreciate your flexibility. Yeah, thank you.
So I was thinking a lot of people in the group know of you, have heard of you, know your work, and we have a lot of people that don't. So perhaps you just wanted to start by giving a wee introduction about yourself and your background.
Sure. My name is Maree Kauppi. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I have a private practice in Madison, Wisconsin in the US. And I divide my time between my private practice and training therapists all over the world to work with sex issues, because I kept hearing as a sex therapist that clients were having a hard time finding a therapist who was effective working with sex issues. And I thought, maybe I can fix that. So I've devoted quite a bit of time and energy into trying to fix that. And it's going really well. I've trained hundreds of therapists to work with sex issues and also with marginalized sexual populations. So sexual marginalization, like alternative family structures like polyamory, alternative sexual practices like BDSM, kink, and alternative sexual identities like either of those things, and also LGBTQ plus identities, including asexuality. So all of that is kind of in my wheelhouse and really fun stuff for me. And then one thing kind of led to another, and I wrote a book about working with clinical challenges related to polyamory. And that was just because it seemed like the most needed thing that I had. When it comes to working with broader sex issues and desire discrepancy, at least I have an online course that I could point people to that's really robust. But when it came to polyamory, I taught some online courses, but I just ended up feeling like I wasn't reaching nearly enough people to actually be of use. So I started writing the book. And then when I got most of the way, probably all of the way done with a draft, I thought, oh, not everybody can find a therapist or afford a therapist. I really should write this book for a dual audience. So I ended up rewriting it.
Wow.
Because I wanted it to be a self-help manual as well. Wow. I don't love the gatekeeping thing, like the idea that in order to heal yourself, you need a physician. In order to work with your mental health issues, you need a therapist. It feels overly restrictive to me. There are lots of smart people in the world who can do a lot to help themselves. And so I just suddenly had the inspiration that it's not even within my values to write a book that's just for sort of a high level group and gatekeep about it. So anyway, that's the story of how my book came about. And it turned out to be kind of a big fat book that's a pretty deep dive into everything I could think of that could help people either with a self-help project about making polyamory or other forms of consensual non-monogamy work better for them, or a therapist to get more traction when they're working with clients.
Great. So you're a really perfect person for me to be interviewing about polyamory. And I've got some such really interesting questions. I've got 6 questions in total. And I'm going to try and do a bit of timekeeping on this. But anyway, let's jump into it. So I know that you've talked before about working with people in polyamorous relationships, and you always make the comment that, like, who do you work with in the therapy room? And you say, well, I work with the decision makers, right? So here's the question. Someone wanted to know, in a hinge relationship that started as a primary relationship, then a second person came along. The primary partner has some trust concerns that have come up with that secondary person. Would you work with the hinge plus the primary partner and the hinge and the secondary separately at all? Or who would we work with in that situation?
Well, if it's still a primary secondary structure, then that suggests to me that that originating dyad, the primary dyad, is the decision-making body.
Yeah.
So I might start there
Mm-hmm.
and find out what their goals and challenges are, what their agreements are, how they feel about it, like what could we do to sort of smooth out the dynamics between the two of them, and then and also clarify what they want for themselves and what they want for their open relationship. And once underway, I'll work with any combination of people that is expedient. So,
Okay.
and it's really common then to need to work with a hinge and a secondary, or all three, or whatever, whoever's having difficulty communicating.
Cool.
But that's not usually where I start. I like to kind of understand what the power dynamics are and what the agreements are, starting with the decision makers and then working my way.
Mm-hmm. So you'd start with that primary couple to start, because they were the decision makers. They're the kind of, and then going from there. So getting that really solid, knowing what their foundation is essentially, and then branching out as needed.
Mm-hmm. And the hinge is a really powerful role, and it's a role that differentiation is really, really important. So a hinge partner that has difficulty managing boundaries, or difficulty figuring out what they want, or difficulty communicating what they want, or is a little conflict avoidant, or, any weakness in the hinge will show up in everything. So if, I love working with hinges individually, because I can help the whole family system stabilize with a strong hinge.
Oh, nice.
Which is kind of an interesting project. I think, as relationship therapists, we always are sort of grappling with, what do we do with the individual client who comes to us to work on the relationship? And I think you can do a ton of good by helping your individual client increase their level of differentiation in sort of all 4 domains of differentiation of self. And then that'll move forward into their relationships. And I would say that's also true of hinges.
Cool. Next one. When only one person in a monogamous relationship is driving the idea of opening up, this is a situation that was noted by someone that very rarely works in the long run for them. I'm pretty sure I've read stories or examples where you've talked about, for sure, you've worked with that and successfully. So I'm kind of curious, what makes it possible to create a satisfying for everyone polyamory relationship when the push for opening comes mainly from one person? So you might have like an intellectual agreement or a buy-in on some level by their partner, but they're definitely not the one that has a personal desire for it.
Yeah, I have worked with that a fair amount. I like working with that kind of situation, because I feel like I'm providing a service that's hard to find. Partly because I have just a different opinion. In my opinion, that's completely workable. Most open relationships that I've seen start with one partner really driving the opening. And the question is not so much who wants it in originally, but what do they do next? So I think it's great when that comes to therapy kind of early on, before it blows up, before anything egregious starts happening, or, it's nice if there are no broken agreements. It's nice if the 2 people who are talking about whether they want to open up or not can stay sort of at a meta level of the conversation. What do we think about it? What do we believe about it? What do we want in our relationship? Like in terms of safety, security, excitement, adventure, like what are the qualities of relationship we're looking for? How can we imagine those qualities of relationship in different forms of relationship, and different kinds of opening up, and different kinds of monogamish, like all of those variables. I think we have, certainly many clients I work with have a cultural bias that safety and security, reliability, dependability come with monogamy. And I think separating all the different variables and starting to imagine, how could you create an open form, whatever it might look like, that has safety and security for you? What would that look like? How could you create monogamy that has the amount of adventure that you're interested in? What's in sort of the spaces in between, monogamish? What kind of semi-open or sometimes open or openish kind of agreement might, so we sort of break the gridlock where I think it has to be polyamory and I think it has to be monogamy. Instead, like, what are all the moving parts, and break all the little chemical bonds between all those parts and start mixing them around and start a much higher level conversation long before we get to anything like decision making. So that we're really expanding the field of what's possible and what's imaginable before we start narrowing the field.
So I'm hearing it's almost like you're really slowing things down in terms of kind of, let's put that decision way over there for a bit and let's just talk about all of this and really dig deep into what is it actually that's important to you in relationship in general, and how could it be met in all these different ways, and really exploring all of that with each person. So it's kind of like a real clear sort of sense of them as a partnership.
Yeah, and also expansion. I think our ideas about what's possible relationally are culturally prescribed. And so a lot of people are just sort of locked in by a failure of imagination.
Right.
And I think that's true of a lot of therapists that have difficulty working with open relationships. They just never saw one that worked. And so how are they supposed to believe in it, So if you can start to kind of imagine, how could it feel safe? Let's imagine. And so by keeping it out of the decision-making realm, nobody's getting cornered into, as soon as you see that this could be safe, you're going to have to do it. No, we're going to imagine all the possibilities, and then we'll have a conversation about what we want and what we don't want, what we're afraid of, and decision-making. We'll narrow things later, but first, let's broaden things so that we don't close out options that would be beautiful for us just because we never thought they could be.
Yeah. How often do you have people arrive at that stage that they can still talk at that level? I'm just thinking, like, most often, 6 years or something that people wait on average before they get couples counseling. So affairs, horribly broken agreements, no one's helping in the house anymore or with the kids. Like, that would be an amazing situation to have a couple arrive in that beautiful, is that common for you, or?
No.
Oh, okay. What do you do when they come with those broken agreements and everyone's emotionally heightened?
Well, it's just a little bit different, but ultimately I still don't want them to shut down what's possible from a failure of imagination. So we eventually will hopefully get to a point of it's hard to find a good word here. I don't want to say decouple, but like breaking the molecular bonds between, for instance, our idea of safety and security and monogamy.
Yeah.
We have like an idea that safety, security, and monogamy go together. Well, we've all seen plenty of monogamy that was not safe or secure.
Yeah.
And I've seen plenty of polyamory that is safe and secure. So if we can like separate those two ideas, safety and security, and the relationship shape, and imagine, how could that work? How does that work? And we also think monogamy, boring, but what if you could have monogamy and adventure? What would that look like? And then everybody starts moving a little bit more, and they're not quite so much in their gridlocked, cemented in posture of defensiveness. But the more kind of hurt and stuff has gone by before they come, the harder it is to work that magic trick.
Yeah. Okay.
And get to that point where, it's possible. Nobody is good at imagination when they're guarded and they're feeling like they're being backed into a corner, or when they're guarded and they feel like they're misunderstood about a major hurt or a breach of trust that happened some time back. So often a repair has to happen before you can really move forward. People have to get to a space where they can actually imagine what they want for themselves and begin to imagine outside of their safety box without feeling actually unsafe, even in the imagining, right?
Yeah. Cool. So this came from someone who is living within the polyamory community. New Zealand, as you can imagine, is pretty small, and even our biggest city is still pretty small when it's looking at a community such as that. So their question is, how does a therapist balance living a polyamorous life with a variety of partners and metamours with working with clients who are within the same broad circles? In other words, how close is too close?
Yeah, everybody has to make that decision for themselves. And that everybody's license or degree has particular ethical guidelines. ASECT, the certifying body of my specialty, so that's the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, says no dual relationships, period. So if you're an ASECT certified sex therapist, you've got some different professional ethical guidelines, then you might, with a different license. Like my LMFT, marriage and family therapy license, says no dual relationships until, I forget what it is exactly, 3 years post-treatment or something like that. So time goes by and you can do it. ASECT says, yeah, time goes by, you still can't do it. So that's why I haven't memorized the number. Okay. It's like, it's irrelevant to me.
Yeah. Okay. So for most people, it'll be their association of counselors or association of psychologists. I guess the psychologists will have some kind of registration or something. So it's within whatever your code of ethics. Yeah.
That's right. And then, a code of ethics is an interesting thing because the ASECT one got amended to, it was, I believe, no dual relationships of any kind ever. And it got amended to define dual relationships that are harmful to the client. And so now you've got like this little loophole. Is it harmful to the client? Is it potentially harmful to the client? How do you make that decision? And, when you're in that like super murky zone, I think safest is not to do it. But then on the other hand, what are you going to do with your personal life? And how are you going to, right? So,
or I'm even just thinking about like, it's one thing being on a dating app maybe and choosing to not, send a message to someone who was, is some kind of connection. But if you turn up to a social event and then someone's there,
right?
Do you leave? That seems ridiculous. Yeah.
No. Yes, you leave. The same thing comes up in the kink community, and I've heard lots of discussions about that. So where do you go to do kinky play? Because, to me, the least erotic thing I can think of is like wearing fishnet stockings and a corset and then facing a client of mine. Just like, oh my God, this is not my idea of eroticism. So if that described me, I would play like way the hell outside of my personal community.
Yeah, okay, so that's one of the options, that you might just choose where you play. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that a lot of therapists who are kinky do in fact play outside of their local communities, because in these small marginalized groups, your clientele might be a large percentage of the community. You might have enough problems not having dual relationships between your clients and your other clients, right? And managing all of that stuff, how close is too close, without even bringing your own dating life into it. There's a story that a sex therapist colleague of mine tells us, just like a horrifying story of a gay man having casual sex with a guy, like hot blowjob sex, and then realizing, oh my God, this is an ex-client of mine. And it's just like, oh my God. So like, it actually does happen.
Of course. Oh, shit.
And it's just one of those situations where I don't know what's your risk tolerance. I know what mine is, very, very low. But everybody has to make this decision for themselves, because there's also your own personal mental health and your own personal relationships. But we do have a world community at this point. And so, it is more and more possible to have relationships long distance. I do know people who have long distance relationships and that, are sexual and intimate and involve travel, and that kind of thing is possible. It's also possible to work as a counselor in a way that you can do. What if you do all of your work by telehealth and your coaching for people who aren't in your local area or even your local country. I mean, I think that if you're a coach, I could have my whole entire practice not be in the United States. And the United States is like big enough for all of us, but New Zealand, maybe not. So I don't know, like, could you move your personal life out of your country? Could you move your professional life out of your country? And if neither of those seems viable to you, then what's your personal risk tolerance and how do you want to manage all that?
Yeah. Okay, cool. That was good. Do you have, so one of my colleagues is putting together a list of questions to ask one's metamour with a client who was wondering if there are guidelines or suggestions to help new metamours navigate their relationship. I wonder if Martha has something like this.
I don't. I have some experience working with clients who want to form different kinds of relationships with metamours. So I can just attest that there's a huge amount of variability there. Some metamours don't want to meet each other. Some do want to meet once, and some get vetted, kind of, like introductory conversation, or these are my rules, or this is what my expectations, or and some want to know each other casually, bump into each other, be comfortable. Some want to be intimately involved sometimes, and in some ways, some want to be really close friends. So those are some questions right off the bat. Like,
yeah, so it kind of almost starts first. What do you actually want? Once again, it's like the other stuff. Really explore what do you actually want first, because that will 100%, that will take you to the next step of how are you going to navigate this? Because it's going to be wildly different if it's just, you want one meeting versus I want us all to be living together and being intimate.
Yeah. So I would start with, what do you want for yourself?
Yeah.
And that can be a very complicated question and answer. It seems like such a simple one, but sometimes it takes a long time for somebody to figure that out, especially in a polyamorous kind of situation where they may feel a lot of external or internal pressure to conform in a particular way with what their partner's desires are, or what their local community's norms are, or whatever. Everybody kind of is worried about doing polyamory wrong. And different community norms can be a lot to handle. And so figuring out what you actually want for yourself, that would be question one. Question two, how do you want to handle it if the metamour wants something different? So there's a level of differentiation of just figuring yourself out so that you can accurately represent what you long for or desire or prefer. And then there's the relational component of accepting differences of someone else. And, because the likelihood that two metamours are going to want the exact same thing is no higher than any other two strangers. Like, probably
that's where
not, maybe not.
Seeing even again that there's room for maybe working with whoever the couple is in that sense, the metamour plus, or whichever, whether it's a hinge or a multiple sort of scenario, but kind of, again, it could be that whatever that metamour or that person in that role that they want, if that maybe clashes with their partner who has that other relationship, then there might be some couples work coming up as a result of that as well.
It's true. Yeah.
If there are expectations or feelings of obligation to want a certain thing or whatever.
Yeah, and there sometimes is, in a primary dyad, sometimes there will be some pressure from the hinge.
Yeah.
Like, I want you to be friends with, it's like, who gets to make that choice?
Yeah.
Right? Consent, and differentiation. So we have different opinions, we have different preferences. How are we going to go with this? What is my decision to make? What is your decision to make? Feel free to lodge a request, but ultimately I get to choose my own friends and my own preferences.
Yeah.
So that sort of, there can be a coercive vibe around that just requires like a little or a lot of work around differentiation.
Yeah. Cool. When metamours need to repair a breach of trust or conflict, What steps do you think are required in that repair process that are unique to the metamour relationship and perhaps the wider polyamorous relationship?
So a breach of trust between two
The
metamours?
metamours, yeah. I've got a couple of examples. So if there was a safer sex agreement that was broken, or partner A thinks that partner B is trying to take their shared partner away from them, or, you know, one of the people think that the other one is giving too much to their other partner in a hinge, changing plans to look after the needs of one person at the expense of the other partner. So there's kind of a sense of, damn you, over to the other side, or conflict.
Yeah, those kinds of situations don't speak to me so much of a problem between metamours as a problem with a weak hinge.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a hinge partner involved in this, which, you know, unless we're talking about a triad,
Kind of assuming it, but
yeah. So if we're talking about a triad, it's a different situation because it's a family decision-making body. But if they're even in a non-hierarchical V, where there isn't a power difference between the hinge and each of the hinge's partners, the hinge has a self. The hinge has a self and a preference and a lot of boundaries to manage. So let's imagine that there's a hinge between you and me. So each of us is having a relationship with the same third person.
Mm-hmm.
And let's imagine that I say, I'm having a hard time. I don't want you to go out with Maree tonight. I want you to stay home with me. Now let's imagine that the hinge is unable to figure out what they want and they're people pleasing. And so they just go along with me. And then what they tell you is, Martha wanted me to stay home. Now there's a problem between metamours, but I would like to point out that I actually think the problem is the hinge.
Mm-hmm.
Because the hinge made their own decision. The hinge decided. So that partner decided what to do with their time that night and then just sold me out. What the hell? So, and the same kind of situation in any of those examples. So I think that metamours look to each other when they should be looking to the hinge.
Cool. You mentioned if it was a triad, so then it would be more like getting the three of them in the room and talking it out, or?
Well, if it's a triad where they make decisions in unison and they come to like consensus decisions, or have some sort of decision-making structure that involves all three of them, then yes, it would be very completely different. So they're all partners with each other, which is very different from you and me being partners with somebody else. Yeah. So in that situation, I would certainly say that any two people who are in conflict with one another should talk to one another directly.
Mm-hmm.
And but metamours in conflict with one another are a little in a different category usually, I think, because usually the problem is actually with the hinge, who's just passing the buck or being weak about owning their own choices and decisions. The hinge is a super tough role to be in. It requires a lot of differentiation to get all that emotional boundary stuff sorted and be able to actually take responsibility for your choices. I'm sorry, Maree, I decided that I want to meet the emotional needs of my other partner tonight. And that doesn't mean I don't love you. And that doesn't mean that you're not important to me. And it doesn't mean that I wouldn't make that choice differently next time. But this is how I'm deciding it tonight. And all the details of how I'm making that decision, not really your business. I mean, that's a stronger hinge, right?
Wow. Yeah. And that's one that's not shying away from conflict as well.
That's right. And when the hinge behaves like that, it starts to look clearly like, okay, we need to sort out our stuff with the hinge, right? If you have a complaint about how they handled that, that's where, right?
Yeah. So I'm assuming in a situation like this, you're going to end up maybe with an individual person coming to a session telling you about this. I have a problem with my metamour, and you're just seeing this one person. So would you basically talk to them about the importance of the their hinge partner.
I would, in the same way that, like, let's imagine it's not polyamory at all, it's infidelity instead. Let's imagine that the male partner is the one that had the infidelity. So we've got, and they're all straight. So there's two female partners and there's one male partner. There's one marriage and there's one infidelity. We see this regularly, where somebody is complaining, I hate that bitch because she broke my marriage.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a minute, who broke your marriage? You don't know her. I don't know her. She could be the, best person in the world. Who is it you had an agreement with? And they broke their agreement. So that whole, like,
where's the finger pointing going in a way? Or
it's just like, where's the decision-making body? Who is it that broke your agreement? Who is it that broke your agreement?
Yeah, that's a nice, what it boils down to. Yeah.
Yes. The only person who can break your agreement is the person you had an agreement with.
Cool. Yeah. I like that. In polyamorous relationships, do you think there's ever a need for evenness or balance? I feel like I know you're going to say no. In a polyamorous relationship. So in a couple that each person has a lover, that like everyone needs to have the same amount, that idea of, and how do you navigate if someone is asking for this idea of fairness? Like, I'm doing this and therefore they shouldn't. I mean, I'm doing this and therefore they should, or I'm not doing this and therefore they shouldn't. Whether it is like, I have X amount of partners, therefore they need to have X amount of partners, or I'm not seeing people for this particular reason and therefore they shouldn't do that as well.
Well, that's also often, it's very, ledger keeping, right? So I think when you're at the stage of, if I do it, you have to do it. If you do it twice, I have to do it twice. You're like, something's wrong. And it's not honoring the diversity of different preferences and different styles. So I definitely don't think that it's a requirement of workable polyamory that everything be even Steven. It rarely is. And I think this is true of any relationship, not just a polyamorous relationship. Like the whole ledger thing doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It seems to me like this dyad has these strengths, this dyad has those strengths and challenges. Everything doesn't have to be matchy-matchy. And if it did have to be matchy-matchy, we're all screwed because there's a whole lot of diversity in the world. So, I've just seen the evidence of my own two eyes, so many relationships where this person wants to have only one partner ever. They just like fell in love with somebody and they've been together for 25 years and it's super stable and that's how they are happy and that's all good. This one wants to have 15 new partners regularly and that's just the way they roll. And that's fine too. Like the question just is it fine? And if it's fine, it's fine. And it certainly doesn't have to match in order to be workable.
Yeah.
I bet that did not surprise you a bit.
No, I knew that answer. I was already, so that's why every single one of these questions I've thought, what do I think Martha's going to say? And what's the follow-up question? So my follow-up question was, how do you navigate that though, if someone is asking for it?
Well, I let them know I don't think it's actually reasonable to expect your partner to be just like you in this or any other regard. So is there a part of you that's curious to know what your partner's perspective is? And my assumption always when I'm working with anybody is that everybody's different from everybody else. And I think mostly we want to know the people that we love. I think we mostly want to know them, and also there's a part of us that's scared to know them. And I think that we want to be, we are intrinsically interested in differences. I think we're attracted to differences. We're curious about differences until they start to feel a little threatening, like maybe that difference is scary. And then we get all confused. And then a part of me is curious and a part of me is scared. So is there a part of you that's curious to understand how your partner sees this differently from you? Might be my starting question there. And if it's very difficult for that person to consider that, I might want them to have a conversation between those two aspects of themselves, the part that is curious and the part that is really not curious at all because they're just guarded and they're scared they're going to be left or some other scary to them outcome. So, but I think the problem, if I were going to identify where the problem is in the desire for your partner to be just like you. It's not reasonable to expect that your partner is going to be just like you. So what is it about the difference that's scary? What is it about the difference that's intimidating to an aspect of yourself? And I would use parts language there because I want to leave room for the part that isn't scared about that and that's curious about that actually wants to know them, even if they're different, even if it's a little bit scary. I want to leave room for that part to grow a little bit. And it's usually there. It just might be very, very tiny at this stage in the work.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Earlier you said something about the 4 aspects, or I'm not sure exactly which word it was, but the 4 da-da-das of differentiation. And I was in my head, I thought, oh, I have it in my head as if there's 3, like know yourself well, and then be able to talk about that and remain steady if someone disagrees. And then the 3rd, listen to someone else. What's the 4th one?
The 4th one is underlying all of that, hold steady. So,
all right.
Yeah, be able to, and you got it right. I just started talking about it a little differently. At some point I realized, it's actually 3.5, or maybe it's really 4, but the underlying all of those skills is getting grounded enough in yourself and being able to manage your automatic reactions. So being able to identify, I'm triggered here, and this is an automatic reaction that I want to contain versus this is an emotion that I want to mull over and maybe express at some point. But being able to sort of compartmentalize that reactivity enough to get actually curious and lean in to figure out what your partner's experience is separate from your own. So holding steady, I think, is a big enough aspect of all 3 of those that it deserves a spot of its own because it's a whole different skill set. Managing the emotions is a whole different skill set, and it relates more to attachment. But it underlies. Without that foundation, it's not going to be possible to look inside yourself and figure out what you think and feel and prefer. And it's certainly not going to be possible to say it to somebody else. And it's certainly not going to be possible to get curious about somebody's differing perspective.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we've been through all the questions, and Woo! Awesome that we made it.
This is like speed dating.
I know, right? It's awesome. So I was just wondering, is there anything in general, like as a parting comment, that you think is just super important that any therapist who is going to be working with polyamory, is there anything that it's really important that they know, or that they kind of just a really core, basic, important thing?
Yeah, I think the most core thing is that polyamory can actually work, and that there is such a thing as a securely functioning polyamorous relationship. And, it's so marginalized and so closeted for lots and lots of people that most therapists have never seen it in real life. And so that's why I think it's important that I just keep saying it exists in real life. It exists in the wild. I've seen it a whole bunch of times. When it works really beautifully, it rarely shows up in therapy, which is part of the reason why you've never seen it. It's working. And then you've never seen it because if you don't reach out to that community and say, I'm a safe place to talk about this, they're going to go to some therapist who does, right? Because it's a marginalized thing. And they've already been to plenty of therapists who say, well, you know what your problem is? Your problem is that you're in an open relationship. You want to fix this situation, go with monogamy. And if that's just not how you roll, the result of that is going to be you're just going to walk out of that therapy and you're not going to go back. So the only reason that I think that therapists haven't seen it in real life is because it's so marginalized. That it's like a word of mouth referral system. People contact me all the time saying, who do I go see? They want to see me. They think I'm going to be the only one. And I'm like dealing out clients like crazy, trying to find therapists to make referrals to. So there's plenty of people who need a therapist who knows that polyamory can work and who has some kind of an idea of how to make it work. Like, what are the skills and how do you break that down so that you can be helpful without reverting to, well, now here's your problem. You're in an open relationship. It's got to be something else. And so that's where I think those aspects of differentiation are the backbone of case conceptualization. You've got to have a way of looking at what's going on and saying, here's a place where this is breaking down. It's difficult for you to figure out what you actually think. And so you're people pleasing and you're making agreements that you couldn't possibly keep. Or here's where things are breaking down in this particular interaction. You're having difficulty saying what's true for you. It's screaming in the back of your head, no, 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 no. And then what comes out of your mouth is sure, or here, look at this. You're having difficulty hearing what your partner is saying without getting defensive. It's difficult for you to hold steady and get curious, so you're not really understanding their perspective. That's where it's breaking down. None of that is the same as polyamory as your problem.
Yeah.
Or you're just getting swamped by all your emotional reactions and responses, and you don't have much of a repertoire for managing uncomfortable emotions. Well, that's going to show up as a problem in any relationship that you're in. It's not special for polyamory. None of this is special for polyamory, by the way. So that's why the only part of it that's special for polyamory is I believe it can work. That's the part that's special for polyamory. All the rest of it generalizes to any relationship.
Yeah, cool. That seems like a lovely spot to finish up on.
Awesome. Let me know if you have follow-up questions. I imagine you might.
Possibly. Yeah. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. I really, really appreciate you taking your time and sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Bye.
Bye.